So my name's Summer Simpson, and I am the head of product and growth at Quantcast. And I focus mainly on the measure product, which is the insights and analytics that we provide for publishers. So the framework is a way for the entire ecosystem, from the buy side to the sell side and everybody that's involved in between, to make sure that they are basically compliant with GDPR. So we needed a way for companies that don't have a direct connection with consumers to work through publishers to get consumer consent. And also be transparent with them about the companies that are accessing the personal data and processing it and why they're doing that, so that we obviously respect consumer privacy, but are also compliant with the law. And it was really important that we had a way that we could capture that consent, store it, and then also pass that information around to all of the other companies and vendors that are involved in doing things from not just serving ads, but also analytics, providing services for publishers, all of the companies that provide data services for them. So really, it's beyond just serving ads. It's anything that a publisher needs for their site to function. Personalized advertising, personalized content, the measurement that they do to understand how users are using their site. All of that is, if people set cookies or they access the user's device in some sort of way, they're required to get consent. And then from a transparency perspective, companies need to make consumers aware of why they're using their data, how they're using that data. So anyone who maybe doesn't necessarily need consent, but might require on some other legal ground, like legitimate interest, still has to be listed and displayed to the user so they know everything that's going on. And I think this was a really important thing that kind of went in from the beginning in the development of the framework. With e-privacy directive, with GDPR, and with the upcoming e-privacy regulation, a lot of the responsibility and the pressure is put on publishers because they do have that direct connection with consumers. And what we wanted to do was make sure that we could all continue to operate, to serve really interesting, contextual, relevant advertising to consumers, make sure that publishers could still operate and monetize their content with advertising and continue to be able to provide that content for free to their consumers. We wanted to take as much of the pressure off of publishers as possible. So we wanted the framework to be super simple, easy to understand, easy to implement, and low to no cost to publishers. It's tough to be a CMP. There's a lot of work involved. The whole ecosystem is incredibly complex. The good thing about the framework, especially for us, and we chose to be a CMP because we have direct relationships with a lot of publishers and also a lot of advertisers. So it was important for us to make sure that they were able to get the consent and provide transparency to their users as much as possible, so that they could continue working, right? But for us as a CMP, the framework makes it really easy for us to communicate with all the other vendors, so it's the easy part of building a consent solution is the UX. Right, so all the pieces are made available by IAB Europe by the specification. We've got the global vendor list, which we use and pull that into the UX so that consumers see all that. IAB make sure that that's maintained, it's up to date, and we can get that easily. So UX is the easy part. Then there's once we capture the consent from the consumer, we store that information in a cookie. And it's done in such a way that any company that's a CMP There's lots of them. I think we're up to like 40 now. We don't have to talk to each other. The framework does that for us. So we're able to save the cookie for the consumer, store their consent signal, and then any other CMP that might be on a site that consumer goes to can just read that information. So it's super easy for us to all speak the same language and then make sure that that consent signal gets passed along up through the ad ecosystem as well. I think it was important for the industry to come together because essentially what GDPR is trying to address is an industry problem. And the only way that it's going to get solved is if we as an industry solve it. Requiring publishers to deal with the things that happen with consumer data within our ecosystem is never going to work. They're not in a position to be able to do that. So I think it's really important that we came together as a group. We're all collaborating, cooperating, and making sure that publishers get what they need in order to be able to get consent for us, which is really important, and that we're still able to maintain being able to deliver advertising and do all the things that all the other companies in the ecosystem do. With GDPR, a lot of people talk about consent. You hear consent a lot. That's just one legal ground. And for the most part, that really has a lot to do more with the e-privacy directive and the setting of cookies and accessing users' devices. And there are a lot of companies that don't necessarily do that. They collect personal data from users in other ways. For the point of providing a transparency to consumers, there are companies that may not be collecting information and leveraging consent, but they leverage legitimate interest instead. But consumers still need to know that those companies are acquiring their data and processing it. So the framework allows vendors who sign up for the global vendor list for each of the purposes that are laid out to say whether they're relying on consent or whether they're relying on legitimate interest, so that then like we as a consent management provider can take that information and display it properly to the user. So for the ones that need consent, we display those and allow users to opt out of those or opt in. And for the ones that are leveraging legitimate interest, it's more of a, hey consumer, these companies are also leveraging your personal data and processing it in some way, just to kind of let people know so that things are completely and fully transparent. It's a law that there's a lot of interpretations to it now. We don't know how things are really going to work out, how consumers are going to respond, how regulators are going to interpret things. So things are going to continue to change. We have a lot of participants, in the ecosystem who have their own sets of needs and requirements, and we have to be able to respond to that as well. One thing that we recently have done is we rolled out what's called the pubvendors.json file. I don't know how this got the name, but it's essentially an out-of-bounds mechanism for publishers to communicate to the entire ecosystem like what their preferences are. So they have limited transparency, just like consumers do, into everything that's going on in the ecosystem, but they want to be able to say, these are the set of vendors that I have direct relationships with, or these are the vendors that I know perform particular services through my site, and they're the ones that I want to work with. Not only that, so this becomes what's called a white list, right? So they're basically say, of all the vendors that are in the global vendor list, these are the folks that I want to work with. And then it limits those vendors to be the ones that are able to get consent or provide services under legitimate interest on the site. It also allows them to go even a step further and tell vendors, I know that you say that you use consumer data for these 3 purposes and this particular feature. When you collect data from my site, I'm good with you using data for these purposes, but I'm not okay with you using it for this particular feature. So it just gives them a lot more control over how data that's collected from their consumers who they've got the relationship with under their brand, how it all works.